so I want to talk about PLCs first of all, because all of this really ties together with a nice bow into a PLC. So a lot of people say to me, I have a PLC. I have a PLC in my school. I'm part of a PLC. And so I want to talk about that because I think we loosely use that term. So let's talk about what a real PLC is and what a loose interpretation of a PLC is. So PLCs, this is a great book if you ever have time or if you guys want to do a book study. Highly recommend this book. It's Learning by Doing by Rick DeFore. And Rick DeFore poses 4 questions, right? And so you can narrow everything down to these 4 questions. What do we want students to learn? Okay, and you know that by unpacking standards, which is what we're doing today. So what do we want students to learn? When we unpack standards, we know what we want students to learn. How do we know if they learned it? So in other words, what evidence do you use to tell yourself, yep, they got it. That's exactly what I wanted them to learn. What do we do if they didn't learn it? So when you get that data in front of you, how do you know they didn't learn it, and what do you do when they didn't learn it? And how will we respond if they already know it? So those are 4 guiding questions to a PLC, okay? And again, that's a great resource, and that's where this comes from. So PLC's overview, this is what Rick DeFore says, okay? We need a pacing guide, and the emphasis of the pacing guide is on unpacking the standards, because we cannot take every single standard and say, number 1, number 2, like day 1, this standard, day 2, this standard, day 3, this standard, because they're not all made equally, right? Standards can't all be treated the same. So when we unpack standards, we build a pacing guide based on that unpacking that we do. So first thing we do is we have our pacing guide when we pack the standards, and that's where we'll spend a lot of our time today, is there. Then we create a common assessment prior to the beginning of instruction. So I am not teaching yet. All I'm doing is creating I'm pacing, and then I'm creating an assessment that goes with my pacing. And when I say that, there's gotta be cuts. There's gotta be we have to chunk our pacing guide. So this group goes together. So I'm gonna cut here, and I'm gonna create a common assessment right here. Because remember, Rick DeFore says, how do you know they learned it? So how do we know they learned it? And that's different than doing problems in class. That's giving them that target goal. So back to what Leslie said, when you look at those items, you know where you want them to go. And that's how you plan with those common assessments at the very beginning. After you give them the common assessment, okay, then you do the collaborative data meeting, which is how we know if they learned it. So how do I know if they learned it? Well, I sit down with my data, and hopefully your data is not coming from you sitting there in the dark at night turning pages going like this, because that doesn't give you rich data. Rich data is done in some format, and now we're very fortunate today that we have a lot of different programs that help us do that very quickly. And what you're doing is you're spending time on data analysis and not sitting in the dark at night, lonely, trying to check every single problem, right? So that's how we do this part. How we know if they learned it is by having that data conversation. And then next comes, what do we do now, is the intervention planning. And intervention, I know, and I don't want to mix intervention with RTI. Forget about that RTI right now. I'm talking about intervening for every single student, my tier one intervention. So I gave you the assessment and you don't know, what am I going to do about that now? Or I gave you the assessment and you got 100%. What am I going to do with you while I help you with something you didn't get? So we need to think about that. That's where differentiation comes in, right? So that's another big piece. What I want us to do, an overview today, is going to be looking at these 4 pieces and spending a lot of time in the first one. I want us to think about standards in a deep fashion when we pace. It isn't just writing them down in some order. It's actually thinking deeply about each standard, so we know how much time we're going to dedicate to each standard and how we're going to break that down into many lessons, right? Because one standard can have several lessons to it. So how we're going to do that, and then we're going to take some time to actually do some unit pacing. So, okay, I'm gonna clump all of these standards together, and I'm gonna break them into units that I can use to then create my common assessment and then build from there. Notice that here, when you create the common assessment, you have not started teaching yet, because we have to do that backwards design. So we have to begin with the end in mind, right? So if we don't know where we're going, then it may be harder to get there, right? So if I don't have some sort of plan of where I need to get, it's going to be very difficult for me to get there. So sometimes I think we work really hard, and then we don't see the fruit of that in the data. And it's perhaps because we didn't have the correct map. And the map is the items that really tell me that the student really knows the standard. So we're going to start looking at we're going to jump right in and start looking at some standards. So I picked this one. I very strategically picked these standards, and I'm going to tell you how I picked them. I looked at the standard analysis given to us by TN Reddy. And this standard, 48% of our students in 6th grade get this standard right? 48%. So we have some room to grow here. And when I look at it right away, I'm like, yep, I know why. So I'm going to let you read it. You think about why that might be a standard we struggle with. I think it has so many parts to it. Like when you look at this and you go, oh, order of operations, let me give them 20 problems with order of operations. They got it, I can move on. It's not just an order of operations standard. It's actually really deep. So we're going to work on this one, and we're going to work through this one together. And after we work through this one together, I'm going to give you one to work just in your groups, just to kind of discuss and talk about. So this is how I think of unpacking standards. So I'm going to take the standard, and I'm going to think of it back to RICTA 4. I'm going to think of, what do we need students to be able to do? So I broke it down into these different parts, right? So it says evaluate expressions at specific values for their variables. So if we're not understanding what students are expected to do when it says evaluate, that's it right there. We get tripped up. So what do we expect them to do when it says evaluate expressions at specific values? So when it says evaluate, we need to tell students, when it says evaluate, what are you expected to do? You're going to have an answer at the end. You're going to have something at the end, right? So when we evaluate and we substitute, you will come out with an answer which is different than just leaving it as an unfinished expression. So that's important to communicate to them what the word evaluate means. Include expressions that arise from formulas used in real-world problems. So the way the standard is written, there's a period and then it says include expressions. What do you mean include expressions that arise from formulas? So the students are going to be given some sort of formula, but they will also be able to extract from the problem the value of the variable in the formula, right? So somewhere in that formula there's a variable, but within the problem, students should be able to extract the value of that variable. So we're back to this. I have an expression, correct? I have an expression that has a variable. It's an algebraic expression, but I know what that variable, I know the value of that variable, so I'm plugging it in. So I'm basically taking this and going one step further, but this include means do this with this, or do this with this, right? So it means go back to here, and when I say evaluate expressions, I mean also evaluate expressions using formulas, okay? And then they want them to do one more thing. They want them to do this, and this boils down to what? Solving problems using order of operations. So it's not just going to be, what does this tell me? That these problems up here are not going to be x plus 5, x minus 6, right? 10x. They're going to be more complex than that, because what this is telling me is how far this is going to go. So I want students to evaluate expressions. I want them to do it with formulas. And I want to give them expressions that include what? What does it say it includes? It includes exponents. It includes parentheses. No parentheses, sorry. It's when there are no parentheses, sorry. When there are no parentheses, and you want them to use order of operations to solve through that. So now this is really telling me the depth of that. Because then when they go on to 7th grade and 8th grade, they'll do that, but then they'll use other, right, more complex forms of this. So that's how complex that is. And unless we can break all of that down, we may stop right here and never think about this right here. or we may stop right at the very top and not think about how deep to go. So order of operations gives us a hint here. Whole number exponents is another hint. And then there's other clues that we just talked about.